We became the Soviet Union. We started wasting our money. $14 trillion, it's a number I've heard, declaring wars all over the world and losing them, not even winning. I mean, this horrendous waste of resources when in the US we have such serious problems as healthcare, education, our middle class has disappeared. 50% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. I mean, what is this? This incredible inequality in income is so many problems, and America always comes last.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Dr. Arthur Khachikian. Arthur holds a PhD in international relations from Stanford University, where he wrote a dissertation on great power politics and intervention in the international system. He currently teaches at an Armenian University in Yerevan, that's the capital of Armenia, and he is a friend of Jeffrey Sachs, who actually connected the two of us. Today, we want to discuss the very large picture of contemporary world politics. So, Arthur, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. I hope I deserved the title of being a friend of Professor Sachs. But yes, thank you very much for having me. And I know you have hosted many much more important people. But if there are any thoughts I can share with you, I would be delighted.
The important thing is the analysis, and that's where I would like to pick your brain, because you grew up and then studied at a very interesting time period, right? And you were born a citizen of the Soviet Union, and then yes. Citizenship ended. You became, were again Armenian, also on passport, and went to the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about the atmosphere of the end of the Cold War and what shaped your outlook on international politics?
Thank you for saying that. In a way, I am the product of the end of the Cold War. I'm a product of Gorbachev's new thinking. And I always joke with my American friends in the 90s. I joked with them at Stanford. They said, we won the Cold War. And I said, no, you didn't win the Cold War. I won the Cold War. Look at me. I came here all the way from the Soviet Union with $4 in my pocket. And, I came to this amazing university. And I will be forever grateful to those people who accepted me there. And I did my master's and PhD and worked with some remarkable people. And so I was that living bridge between the United States and Russia and Armenia, the Soviet Union, what was the Soviet Union, and the United States. And it was really an incredible time. I'm in Armenia now. It was here that, when I was a high school student, I listened to the BBC and Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and Radio Free, Freedom at night, which was kind of dangerous because if anybody found out, I would get in trouble. So I was kind of a known dissident back here in my high school. Once I criticized Marx, and I got in a lot of trouble with the principal. But afterwards, this, when Gorbachev came to power, these hopes that we had for a future, this inspiration, it was an incredible time, a very inspirational time. This kind of, you speak some German, I don't speak German a lot, but it was kind of this ode of joy, Zeit und Schwung in Millionen, that kind of atmosphere. And it was here in Armenia. I had a friend with whom I worked at the Red Cross, Eric Wolstein, and he when the Berlin Wall came down, he was driving in the streets of Yerevan with a German flag, celebrating the fact that the wall came down. It was an incredible feeling. We thought that we're now going to put aside the hatred, the war, this propaganda. We're going to be one family, one Europe. And that's what Gorbachev actually wanted to. We talked about common European house, if you remember, common European home, Europe from even like a common security space, I guess, from Vancouver to Vladivostok. There were some really far-reaching statements. I also remember Ronald Reagan. I was quite fond of him. He's a very, very charming person. He came to Moscow, and on Red Square, they asked him, do you still believe that the Soviet Union is an empire of evil? And he said, no, I don't. It was a great time, this feeling of reconciliation and friendship and goodwill and hope. And, nobody can believe this now, but not to mention Yeltsin's speech in Washington when he said, God bless America. And then American, French, and English troops marching on Red Square. Can you believe this? No one would believe this now. But they marched together to celebrate common victory. It was a very inspirational time. And look where we are now. It all fell apart like a house of cards. We came, we went, this whole new world order fell to pieces. It's in shambles. All of it is forgotten. We're now witnessing the bloodiest, the most devastating conflict in the world and in Europe since 1945. And we can only hope that the efforts made by President Trump and President Putin will produce some results, and this bloodshed will end. But it's just a total collapse, a fiasco of all these hopes and all this inspiration, this atmosphere of hatred. In fact, even worse than the Cold War. It's much more dangerous now than the Cold War. We witness the erosion of nuclear deterrence. The concept of nuclear deterrence is eroding. There are open discussions of nuclear exchanges, which did not really take place during the Cold War, maybe with one or two exceptions. With the advent of hypersonic missiles, nuclear proliferation, missile defense systems, it's a much more unpredictable and dangerous environment than what we had. And this kind of intensity of propaganda, I don't think we had that in the 70s or the 80s. It wasn't like this, not this much hatred, open anti-Russian hatred. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. In those days, you separated the communist regime from Russia and the Russian people. Even Western leaders did that. Reagan did that. Margaret Thatcher, another hero of mine, did that too. There was a very careful distinction. And my final point, I'm sorry, my answer is very long, but there is a huge change in the quality of leadership. I mean, we had visionaries. We had people like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, and François Mitterrand, and with all his faults, Michael Gorbachev. Of course, it's very controversial to say this now. In Russia, they don't like it when you say this. But they were people who thought philosophically. They had this systemic, holistic vision of the world. They had amazing foresight and wisdom, which is more than I can say about some of our leaders today, sadly.
How was it? This is on my mind the whole time, and I asked this a lot, and I still can't wrap my head around it. How did we lose that peace? How did we Europeans, and I include all of us, from the Caucasus and Russia and all the way to West Asia and how do we lose that? I mean, it's such a dumb thing to do. It was such a hopeful time. And you look back at it and yes, okay, sure. You can say like the Scorpions and a certain part, there also was like some sort of CIA involvement and, the propaganda. The propaganda was there, and for Radio Free Europe always was a propaganda thing. But there was genuine aspiration, especially from the side of the Soviet Union, to make this better. And, one of the things that Jack Matlock, last US ambassador to the Soviet Union, keeps saying time and again is that the Cold War was ended 2 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was ended because it was in the strategic interest of Washington and Moscow to end it. And only 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed, which actually George Bush Sr. didn't even want. He famously had a speech in Ukraine, in Kiev, in the parliamentary building, saying like, you should not secede. Everybody was afraid of what would happen. And then we went into the 1990s. And then what happened? How did we lose the peace?
Well, of course, you have people who can speak with more authority, but I'll just offer my thoughts. I think there were several reasons. The main one, I think, was what I call the trap of grandeur. When a person gets a lot of money suddenly, he usually loses his head. He doesn't know what to do with it, and he makes silly decisions. When a power and when leaders of a certain power just become too strong and they feel that they can do whatever they want, it plays a trick on them. There was a famous British politician, Lord Acton, in the 19th century, who said, all power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's very dangerous for any particular country to be all-powerful and to be always right. It plays a trick with your mind. Now, I must say that there were a lot of people, and we'll talk about it if you like, many people in the United States who warned about this. So there were a lot of very wise people who had foresight, amazing foresight. And some of them have been mentioned on your program before. There were people who said we shouldn't lose this chance to build one world where we could cooperate with Russia. Russia is a vital partner. And I will go into this with your permission. There was a letter by 50 senators and diplomats, written in 1997, saying that there is no threat emanating from Russia, and the expansion of NATO would be, they said, a mistake, an error of historic proportions. They said that. There's this famous, statement by George Kennan, the architect of containment. It has been mentioned before, saying that this is a tragic mistake. It will bring on another Cold War. My esteemed colleague, William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, he almost resigned over it. And he said, again, it's a needless provocation. You have the telegram, very famous, again, reference to William Burns, who sent a telegram in 2008 saying that the inclusion of Ukraine is the brightest of all red lines. Person after person after person was warning against it. I'm in no way comparing myself to all those people, but there was a conference at Stanford in 1995 or 7, I believe, and there was a debate on this issue. And certainly it was a bit of a show because the issue has been decided by then. But I wrote a small article and I said that the expansion of NATO to the east, if it doesn't take into consideration Russia's interests, would lead to a war in eastern Ukraine, in the Caucasus, would build a new Berlin Wall and a new Iron Curtain, hundreds of kilometers to the east. I wrote it back then, and many of my colleagues were in agreement. But I think what happened is, number one, there were organizational, institutional inertia. There were organizations, research institutions, think tanks, who were created for the business of the Cold War, and they made a lot of money on it. And for them to suddenly stop functioning and find another job or find another application for their resources was not very easy. There was also psychological inertia. There were a lot of people who could not overcome their dislike, hatred, shall we say, for Russia, and continued to see Russia as an enemy. There were people from certain countries in Eastern Europe who very understandably, I must emphasize, understandably had certain feelings on the subject, because it is true that they suffered a lot in the past at the hands of the Soviet Union, and we could understand that. Of course, we have to accept that, but didn't have the wisdom to find the right way of addressing their grievances and moving forward. And there was also the pressure of the diaspora groups, ethnic diasporas in the United States. Bill Bradley, the US Senator, speaks about that. He also says that it was a blunder of fundamental proportions. He says that it was done under these domestic pressures, and Bill Clinton needed those votes, and he needed that platform to win over some of his supporters in the United States. So all of that combined, brought about this result. And I must say, when you end a large war in human history, there's usually what we call a post-war order. And there are certain rules of how this needs to be done. So if you want, I can go into that. So, if you look at how these post-war orders emerge, every time there is a major war, the world leaders come together and say, we don't want this, never again. Let's come up with a way of preventing these wars. It's a cyclical process. So there is, for example, the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia, and there's the Duke of Sully and the grand design of Henry IV, the French king, European Federation, 15 states, equality, equilibrium, common decision-making. Let's not do this anymore. It doesn't work. There's a war of Spanish succession. There is the Napoleonic Wars, the Concert of Europe that emerges after that. There's League of Nations, et cetera, the United Nations. So every time these people come together, there are certain principles on which this is built. The principle of balance and equilibrium, a collective security, restraint, mutual concessions, and very importantly, especially, it's very visible in the Concert of Europe, do not exclude a great power, do not corner a great power. There are many other rules. All of those rules were violated. We went from collective security thinking to bloc politics, partial security. For some reason, politicians, they should know better. They know that security, you cannot ensure your security unilaterally. When you try to make yourself very, very secure, you start threatening your neighbor. This is IR theory 101. This is from Thucydides to Hertz,
It's a security dilemma. It's not even difficult to explain. Dilemma. It's really, 101.
But what is so funny is, I feel like, should I go back to college again? Because you taught me all these things, and somehow this knowledge didn't make it up the organizational chain, because these people should know this. Thucydides, you remember the construction of defensive walls in Potidea and Athens was seen as an act of war, even though it was a purely defensive step. So 2,500 years ago, we knew what the security dilemma is. 18th century Jean-Jacques Rousseau, your compatriot, by the way, I understand. He said that war comes from your efforts to make peace. When you try to ensure peace, you bring on war because you try to make yourself secure at the expense of the others. This is 101, IR 101. Balancing theory, that we know this for centuries. When one side tries to increase its power, its opponent or the other powers usually try to balance against it. It was very easy to see that Russia was going to drift towards China. And I was there. I was a student. I was an interpreter. And by the way, I saw that era where American and Russian officers were, walking hand in hand, smiling, discussing, common European security structure. I was there in the 90s. I was translating for them. And I remember a Russian guy, said, if you push us too much, we're going to go towards China. We're going to go east. And people didn't believe it. And famously, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his grand chessboard, said that it wasn't going to be possible, and we need to use Ukraine to make sure Russia never becomes strong again. So that's that. Balancing. Another rule is inclusion. So the whole project, European integration project, conceptually, why was it put in place? Because we wanted to prevent a new war. We wanted to tie Germany and France so much that it wouldn't be even conceivable for them to go to another war together. And it worked. European integration was a way of uniting nations of Western Europe and Central Europe and making sure war never happens again. We put that principle on its head. We used economic integration not as a uniting force, but as a divisive force, a force for dividing Europe. And we made the European community the avant-garde for NATO. We made economic integration cover for military integration. We coupled those things together, and instead of dividing nations, instead of uniting nations, it started dividing nations, which is exactly the opposite. So some of the post-Soviet republics had to choose east or west. Do you want the West or do you want the East? Do you want Russia or do you want Europe? Which led to this terrible tragedy in Ukraine, because clearly these countries could have benefited from being a bridge between the two. There were some other principles. Do not corner a great power. Do not declare anybody a loser. I mean, look at the concert of Europe. It worked for 40 years because France was included. France was not humiliated. And look at what happened. By the way, Russia did not lose the Cold War. As Ambassador Matlock famously said, they were treated like the loser, and they shouldn't have been. Look at what happened when France was cornered and humiliated in late 19th century, and when Germany was humiliated after World War I, the Diktat. Look what happened with that. I mean, we know this. This is international relations 101. Why did these people not know this? I will never know.
One observation and one question. The observation is, you are absolutely right. One of the things that is constantly underestimated, especially by some realist colleagues, is the importance of these agreements, the moments when we actually end wars by pens, by striking pens, the 30 Years' War, but the 1815, the Vienna Conference. The funny thing is, these are always big parties. These people come together and have big parties. To me, the agreement that actually began the process to finally end the Cold War was also an agreement in 1975, the Helsinki Final Acts. The Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe is the greatest achievement of the Cold War when, with a strike of a pen, you basically hammered out the principles on which actually in the end, Gorbachev and so on said those are the principles and we're gonna abide by them, and well, whatever happens, happens. And they wound it down. But so you're right in the megalomania, but the question now to me, how far is our guilt as IR, international relations scholars, if we create these concepts and then we do not realize that we ourselves are not capable of applying them? And what I want to say with that is, so how is it that we actually understand the security dilemma and people, our colleagues, maybe not you and I, but our colleagues are not able to apply it? A very important experience of mine was that a teacher of mine in my university here in Japan, he literally taught us the security dilemma. But he also argues that Japan needs to have more weapons in order to be secure against China. And when I asked him about that, he said like, oh, but this is going to kick off the security dilemma. He says like, no, because the Chinese would understand that we only need those weapons for self-defense. I mean, they are defensive weapons, even if they can be used for offensive means, but they would understand because we tell them that that's what we're going to use them for. So that's the same person. I do, and he's very smart, very, very good mind. So is it something in the way that we understand or try to analyze international relations that creates the pitfalls of then continuing to do the same stupidity?
There is something to be said about that. I thought about it before our interview. There is a cognitive psychology aspect and there is an organizational politics aspect. Cognitive psychology, there are a lot of biases that we have as people when we think about the world. That argument, they will understand that this is just defense. This was the argument used by a very famous politician. I will not name him because I know him very closely, and you shouldn't talk about him if you want to ever travel to Russia. So he said they should just understand that this is a defensive alliance. We're not threatening you. If you know anything about international relations, you know that in IR, there is no difference between defense and offense. There is no difference. I mean, I just cited an example of Thucydides. Building a wall in Athens was seen as an act of war. It was a purely defensive wall, but it was seen as an act of war 2,500 years ago. We know this. There's the cognitive aspect of it. We always think of our way of thinking and our actions as just, moral,
and rational.
Well-intentioned and rational. And we always think of the opponent as evil, as someone who has bad intentions, who misinterprets the world. He doesn't understand that I'm good, basically. I'm good, I'm rational, my intentions are good, and I do what I must. He is not. He is my opponent, he is evil, he has bad intentions, he's trying to trick me. We never assume that anything that happened accidentally can actually happen accidentally. We see intention on the other side, which was one of the reasons why the Cuban Missile Crisis escalated so far. So he should just understand that I'm good. It's very normal, it's very human. Another thing, what you said, why did this academic knowledge not make it up the organizational ladder? My observation, this is not a theory that I've tested scientifically, is that wise people who are in education, who educate themselves, they see the world as more complex. They see complexity. They see many different variables. And in many cases, they are equilibrium oriented. People who may not have spent a lot of time in education, and they see the world as more simpler. They see a few variables. There's a simpler world, and therefore there's a simpler explanation for everything. So they usually have simple solutions. Wise and educated people, they usually think, and they are full of self-doubt and restraint, and they're very humble. People like this are usually not welcome in politics. Mm-hmm. People, who are in politics and these organizations, they want simple solutions, and they want people who are full of self-confidence. Sadly, these are different types of people. And they're also political narcissists. I don't mean anybody in particular, but it's very tempting to declare yourself the next Caesar or the next Napoleon, the owner of the world, to project your ideas on the world just because you have the power to do so. And powerful countries have this tendency. I mean, take Woodrow Wilson, the most idealistic U.S. president, a great person, but he was an academic in politics. He didn't really fit in there if you read Niebuhr and Carr. So, or the Russian Bolsheviks. They had their vision of the world. It was based on class struggle and the victory of the proletariat, and they thought the whole world should follow. Trotsky believed that there will be a proletarian revolution when we came to negotiate with the Germans in Brest-Litovsk. He didn't even stop his propaganda. He started talking to the German participants at the conference, trying to convert them. It's this thing about projecting your vision on the world that comes with power and with this trap of grandeur. I think it happens. It's also, people who are humble, who think about equilibrium and about complex solutions, they usually don't make it up that organizational ladder. It's my theory. I haven't tested this scientifically.
It's one of the things that I came to understand is that it has nothing to do with the degree of education. Some of the best analysts of international relations I tend to find in taxis. taxi drivers tend to be very well versed in current politics, actually. I've maybe it's just my sampling, but I have several experiences where I travel abroad and I strike up a conversation with the taxi driver, and the taxi driver is very well informed about local politics and connects that, because they're often from abroad, with what's happening at home.
Same here. Same in Armenia. They're very smart.
So so it's nothing to do whether you went to university to study about this. It has to do on how you think, on how you're able to connect pieces of information. So are we lacking kind of a organizational theory of international relations that would explain how, like, information flows or fails to flow and inform decision making?
Oh, we have it. I mean, we have it. We have the theory of how this works. We have organizational theory. We have cognitive psychology. They do explain how a lot of times organizations become blind to new information. They think about everything in terms of the past, the past wars, past experiences, and people have these blinders on. You have your psychological blinders. We're usually closed to new information. Our way of thinking is based on our past experiences, life-changing experiences, educational background. And once we form our opinions, it's very difficult to change them. We're very hesitant. And then we start selectively receiving information. We hear what we want to hear, and we ignore the information that does not correspond to our pre-existing views. It's Jervis, he wrote this like 30 years ago almost. It's a well-known thing. And then you surround yourself with people who say yes. You surround yourself with people who are afraid to tell you what you don't want to hear. And then this becomes a self-replicating process. Both the leader and the organization put blinders on, and they only receive the information they want to receive. They see what they want to see. It was easy to see. I mean, there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of people who were warning that the expansion of NATO is a fundamental mistake. Huge names. I just gave you a few. There are many. But you don't want to change your worldview. Once you have formed your worldview, Russia is bad, West is good. We need to use this opportunity. These people could not overcome this temptation to take revenge and to use the moment of Russia's weakness. They couldn't do that. Senator Bradley said, we kicked them when they were down. We completely mismanaged. And I must say, another thing I must say, and I'm sorry, I'll be brief. When I was there, I saw a genuine will on the part of my Russian friends to be friends with Americans. And I'm friends with both parties. So I'm like in between. It's like my family members. I have my Russian family and my American family. I like them to get along. But I saw this general desire. Russians genuinely admired Americans in the 90s. They thought that Americans are going to give them the answer to their problems. Another tragic thing that happened was the era of gangster capitalism. These reforms were implemented in such a way that when you talk about the 90s now, the Russians cringe. Yeah. They say, well, democracy, liberalism, no, thank you very much. Can we just stick to what we have? Because they tried it in the 90s and it was a horrible time. It was gangster capitalism. They were disappointed. But when I was at Stanford, there was a delegation after delegation coming from Moscow, Russians trying to learn from Americans, teach us how to do business, teach us how to rewrite our laws. They were studying the juridical system in the United States. They wanted to adapt the Russian system to the American justice system in Russia to the American system. There was this general desire. We want to be your friends. Teach us what we have to do. Why would you waste such an opportunity? It's just so hard to understand. I guess some people just could not overcome these cognitive biases, and they continued. Like I just said, they felt that Russians are only doing this because they're forced to do this. There is no genuine goodwill on their part. And it's natural. It's cognitive psychology, sadly.
And our colleague, friend, we talked about, Jeffrey Sachs, was part of the people who went over and did advice, right? But also advised the US, right? And said, like, what you need to do in order to get this running is this. And he keeps telling how he was like rebuffed and how he was naive to believe that the US would do this. But the one just needs to look at how many brilliant Russian analysts and Russian and former Soviet citizens, you included, today converse and do their working in English, and how many American and Western Europeans do their work in Russian. It's like it's not even a question, right? It's the level of being willing to work in and with the West was huge, and then the
huge.
level of rebuffing was equally huge, and then the level. But something you pointed out at the beginning is here very important: the level of animosity and hatred toward Russia today is higher, and the propaganda is higher
Much
than
higher.
before. And Chas Freeman pointed this out on this channel 2.5 years ago. He said he remembers the latter part of the Red Scare in the US, and he said then what we are experiencing today with Russia is worse. The propaganda we're experiencing is worse. How did that happen?
Much worse.
I mean, how come that after all of this, today the situation of propaganda and Russian hate, not Russophobia, Russian hate is higher than before?
Well, I think it's first of all, Russia is seen as weaker, as a weakness. The sign
Yes.
of Russia's weakness. In America, it's seen as a weak power. Even William Perry said that when he was objecting to NATO expansion, they said they are a third-rate country. They'll just do what we tell them to do. Basically, that's arrogance. That's the trap of grandeur I was talking about. Russia is weaker. In the Soviet times, there was a very clear distinction between the communist regime and the Russian people. When Ronald Reagan came to Moscow, when he was speaking to the Soviet people, he always made a distinction between the Soviet regime and communism. He very carefully talked about that. But then he always praised the Russian people and the Russian culture. And now we have this attack, this totalitarian attack on anything Russian. You speak Russian, people look at you. You say, maybe this wasn't a good idea. And you're a Russian agent right away. Right away, you get attacked. There's such degree of intolerance. One thing I want to say, I observe, and of course I'll be accused of being an old man. I don't mind. I'm proud to be an old man. I observe a general decline, not just in the level of leadership and the quality of leadership, but also in quality of education and culture all around the world. And I think it's a theory. We have to test it yet. But I think the ideological competition between the West and the Soviet Union forced both parties to invest heavily in education because you needed to make your population immune to the ideological influence of your opponent. So they invested heavily in education. I must say, the Soviet Union had many faults. There were many terrible things, but there were great things. Our educational system was amazing. We were one of the most educated societies in the world. It's a far cry from what we have today. And what I think this competition between the East and the West made both parties more educated. We thought we were sharper. After that, there's no competition. We declared prematurely the end of history. Remember that famous book? And I wrote at the time at Stanford, I was a very recalcitrant student for some reason, very opinionated. I said, it's not the end of history. It's just the beginning of history. How can you write that? There's so many other models. How can you not realize there's so many other models? It's something about people. You cannot be totally right. It's very dangerous when you lose modesty and humbleness. You have to be humble. Yes, you may be right in a certain sense, at a certain time, but it's very dangerous to project that and say, okay, I found the solution to everything. The solution to everything is my model. And I said jokingly at Stanford with this amazing seminar with my amazing colleagues whom I love dearly, remember, with such gratitude. And we had a seminar, and again, they were pushing this game theory. It's after you don't believe in game theory. I said, listen, I like some game theory, a little bit of modeling, as long as you don't fabricate your numbers. But I have a lot of experience living with totalitarian ideologies. I said, I made them laugh. I said, I lived for 18 years in a country where everything was about class struggle and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Look where they are. Look where I am. Then I lived for another 4 years in a country where everything was about ethnicity and ethnic identity and nationalism. And look where they are. Look where I am. And now I live in a country where everything is about utility and game theory. You know what? I'll survive you too. And they laughed, just as they were roaring with laughter. You cannot be 100% right. Be humble. There is a saying in Russian, if you want to make God laugh, tell him about your plans for tomorrow. Be humble. Don't project your vision on the whole world. Don't think that you're always right in every case. Be humble. There may be things that you're missing. And I think this trap of grandeur, thinking that we're all powerful and we have all the answers, we have won, which we did not. It was a mutual agreement. It was a mutual. Listen to Jack Matlock. You know this better than I do. So this trap of grandeur, it played a trick with us.
Mm. This is a very good observation, because the trick that we play on ourselves is to believe that we know, that we understand, and that includes you and I, right? I mean, we wouldn't be
Yes.
talking here trying to explain if we didn't believe we understood something. So in a sense, I mean, if we take that thought to its ultimate conclusion, everything is relative and nothing matters, and nihilism, and let's switch off the recording and go home. But no, I mean, we're still condemned. I think of this as the necessity, in order to be alive, to accept contradictions. So I need to accept the contradiction that even while I say, like, we should be critical of ourselves, we mustn't lose ourselves in this. But it's just like, this beautiful thing. If you tell a student, never trust your teacher, you bring them into this. You bring them into this impossible situation. If they trust what you say, they don't do what you're telling them. And if you tell them, if they do what you tell them, they will not trust you, which will then again put them into this. You make it impossible to fulfill this. But this is part of what it means to accept the complexity of life. But then the question becomes, how is it that sorry, I'm just lost my train of thoughts. I wanted to go somewhere with this.
No problem. I'm going to look at my notes.
I wanted to go to the point that we play this trick on ourselves, right? Where we believe we understand, and then from this one we start arguing with everybody else, and impose one vision of the world, and that's then usually, when that gets extreme, it becomes an ideology. And when that gets even more extreme, then you try to realize that ideology abroad. And it seems to me that the unipolar moment was one in which the idea that liberal internationalism won over tried to go there and realize it. You try to realize it abroad, and that's when it hit the wall in several places, including in Russia.
I think you just need to be aware of these cognitive traps. So you know your limitations. So you know that, yes, I think I'm right. This is the evidence I have. This is my theory. I think I've proved it. But maybe there are some things I'm not seeing. It's just like when you drive a car, you have the blind spot. Yeah. There's a blind spot to your left and to your right. You turn your head, right? Because you know there's a blind spot. At least in my time, there was sophisticated equipment that makes it unnecessary. But you have to be aware. You have to just remind yourself, okay, but maybe I'm missing something. Let me consider this person's opinion also. And I think being educated in two different systems really helps, because when you're educated in the Soviet Union, again, we had great education, at least at high school level, and you believe in this theory, workers, the capitalists, etc. And then, I was 15, I was in high school, and I told the teacher, okay, but why do the managers and workers always have to fight? Don't they have common interests? If they work in the same company, if the company makes profit, everybody wins. You could see I was a latent American. So the teacher called my father and said, I love your son. That's why I'm calling you and not certain organizations. Please talk to your son, because I cannot have this in my classroom. But being brought up in that system and seeing the holes in Marxist theory, even then was easy. But then when you make it to the West, it becomes more obvious. But then you start seeing the holes in Western way of thinking. Liberalism is a great thing. It's a great thing. I'm all liberal. I wouldn't be listening to BBC under my bed at night, with my shortwave radio if I weren't a liberal. I do believe in human dignity, human freedom of speech. By the way, how liberal is that, to call anybody who disagrees with you Putin's puppet? Is it liberal? Is it really? I had to quit my university because of all this pressure that was applied to me, but it doesn't matter. So liberalism is a great thing, but number one, it's not perfect. Our democracy is not perfect. It has great flaws, like lobbyism, corporate influence, private interests, manipulation of the media, fabricated consent. There are a lot of weak spots. And number two, not every country is ready for it. And number three, you can't do it by force. Just like Jack Matlock said, you should do it by persuasion. How were the Soviet citizens conquered? I can tell you exactly how, because I was one of them. Why did we start loving America so much? Music, film, ideological influence, cultural influence. You can just see that this way of life in many ways is better. Persuasion, that's what worked. America didn't invade the USSR and force us into capitalism. It did not do that. It was much wiser back then. So invading countries and forcing them to adopt your ideology and regime is never, almost never, a good idea. It's funny because all this wisdom of the American political elite of late 20th century, where did it all go? I mean, Americans knew how to do this. They didn't invade the USSR. They converted us by persuasion, by example, by their culture. This is what should have been done. But again, you can't be all powerful and you cannot be all right. You cannot be always right and you cannot be all powerful because that plays a trick with your mind. You become arrogant.
The funny thing is, or the interesting thing, is that the other two great powers, the Russians and the Chinese, are currently deploying that strategy way more than the US. I mean, they're not trying to lead by force. Okay, you have force in Ukraine, in the Donbass, yes. And you have, if you are Georgian, then you will immediately say, hey, we have two provinces that were basically clipped off by force. Yes, that's true. Yes. But in the way that they try to appeal to the global majority, they try to appeal first and foremost with a couple of principles: the equality of states, the principle of non-intervention. This Russia and China are touting those, and they're trying to show how economic development can be done. That doesn't lead into becoming a vassalized state like a lot of Europeans to the US, right? And they try to then say like, hey, we are open for business. And this is in a kind, it was the US strategy in the Cold War, right? To appeal to the others while also doing all of the regime change and so on and so forth. I mean, it went hand in hand, but at least the public appeal was a much more open one than what it has become now. Would you agree?
It's actually what I told my American colleague years ago. I said, you know what's so funny is that China is now behaving like the United States in the late 20th century, and the United States is behaving like the Soviet Union. This is what is so strange. I mean, all this wisdom went away. And yes, exactly. China is using economic influence, cultural influence, technological advances to really spread its influence in this world and slowly, just like America did, slowly conquering the world, but in a different way, not militarily, not by invading countries. And the last 25 years of US foreign policy, I mean, I'm very sorry. I mean, with all my respect to those people who stood behind it, I love them dearly. But it's very difficult to call it a success. I mean, look, Iran, Afghanistan, Libya, Georgia, Ukraine. These are just the five most, Syria, not to forget, this horrible, horrible events. And by the way, you're talking about liberalism and human rights and international law, and you bring an Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra leader to power in Syria, and then you go to shake his hand, and then you give him a makeover like a teenage movie, you know, those teenage movies with makeovers, 16-year-old girl who got a facial and curlers in her hair. What is this?
But all of this, you can still put makeup on a pig, right, and sell it as a pretty lady. You can still do that, but I mean, it's even worse. I mean, look at what this did to the United States. I mean, the US promise was that, look, you will become like us and we are wealthy and prosperous with TV sets and meals at home and so on and so forth.
And you were.
And now we have a generation which is going to be poorer once they reach their parents' age than their parents. I mean, while China, that is being demonized, has lifted 800 million people, 700 million people out of poverty into the middle class. It's like just the comparison doesn't work anymore. You can't portray this one as a failing system and yourself as the shining city on the hill. Reality kicks in, and actually the rest of the world, I believe, sees that. If I talk to people, especially in Southeast Asia and also from Africa and so on, they go like, yeah, we see this.
China is a country, I'm not an expert on China, but from what I know, is a country where 50 million people died of hunger after the so-called Great Leap Forward. 50 million people were eating anything they could find, rats, insects, to survive. And then China adopted the Western model in a very intelligent way. There's a guy called Deng Xiaoping. And now China rules the world. And in the US, we became the Soviet Union. We started wasting our money, $14 trillion, it's a number I've heard, enormous waste of our resources, declaring wars all over the world and losing them, not even winning, losing them. I mean, look at the footage of people, these poor people running after that airplane in Afghanistan, trying to grab onto something to save their lives. It was so humiliating. It reminded me of 1975, I believe, that last helicopter dropped off a US ship off the coast of Vietnam. I mean, this horrendous waste of resources when in the US we have such serious problems as healthcare, education, our middle class has disappeared. 50% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. I mean, what is this? This incredible inequality in income is so many problems, and America always comes last. My hairdresser in New York used to say, America always gets involved with everybody's business except her own. It's just a complete reversal of the U.S. foreign policy, and it has not been a success, sadly.
Yeah, this is just when then the belief about yourself, or the belief of, let's say, at least some of the ruling elites that think of the image of the US as something that they knew as children or as young people, when in fact they are now 40 years older, and the US has become fundamentally different, but they still operate under that mindset. This is necessarily going to lead to a train wreck. And maybe this is the one more thing to talk about, but just briefly, but this influence of belief about yourself or self-image of yourself versus other image of what you are, and what this does to the development of international relations, because it leads to serious risks of misjudging again. And the especially the neoconservative propensity to believe that US military force can solve anything, when in fact it always runs itself aground.
But it's natural. Sadly, it's natural. It's not just the US. In every major empire, the elite used to make, they always made errors like this. When you become too powerful, you have people, and a lot of them, some of them are political narcissists. They have this pleasure of projecting force, of feeling that they own the world. They can do whatever they want. They enjoy this. There are people like this in every country. It's not just the US. Every power has gone through this cycle. I mean, we had the Spanish hegemony, then we had the French hegemony twice, then we had the British hegemony in the 19th century, then we have continental German hegemony. It comes and goes. It comes and goes in cycles. The power distribution changes, the balance of power changes, and then you have people like this saying, okay, here's my moment to be Napoleon. Sadly, but it is natural. It is in our psychology. People who are wise and restrained and humble, they are not welcome in politics and organizations like this. They like people who can say, yes, sir. And they have simple convictions and simple solutions, and they're full of confidence. And that is very sad. Because I could go on and on, but we don't have time. There were dozens of people who warned about the consequence of this fundamental mistake. And it was easy to see. And when they blame one side, of course, violence is terrible. I condemn violence in every case, not just in one case, in all cases. All invasions should be condemned, not just one. But what did Britain do when Germany started arming itself in early 20th century? Did they say, oh, it's just a defensive measure? No. That was one of the major reasons why Britain entered World War I, is the naval race. What did France do when Germany started rearming? Again, for defensive purposes, during the interwar period, they did the same thing. But it's very difficult for people to see the world objectively. It's almost impossible. And then we blame one country for doing something that the other countries did in every single case. There is not a case in world history where one country started expanding its alliance towards another country, by the way, former opponent, and that country said, sure. Why don't you do that? 850 kilometers from Moscow, why don't you just put your missiles there? It's fine. It doesn't bother us, because we know it's a purely defensive measure. This has never happened. When you say things like this, you're putting aside everything we know about international relations for the past at least 2,500 years. So this double standards, hypocrisy, sadly, it's human. It's normal.
I mean, this is why it would be so comforting to believe that this is orchestrated, that there's a public face that tells you one thing, but on the back, like they were always intending to attack Russia, right? That was always the plan.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you have, you just lie to the general public while you do your nefarious things in the back. But I think it's much sadder. I think it's just the stupidity arising out of the complexity of the system.
I think there is the front, what we say and what we project and what we pretend to be, and then there's something that's happening behind that. And I know Professor Sachs, whom I respect dearly, he believes that was the plan from the beginning, and it's difficult not to see that, because when you look at Brzezinski's book, and I can understand this person, given his background, given very painful history of his country, I can understand it, but this was a major mistake.
But Brzezinski's book came out once he was out of power, right? Once he was free to write all of those wet dreams that he had about breaking up the Soviet Empire. I mean, and also the Rand Corporation. It's easy to point toward these reports and say, like, look, they planned it all out. But at the end of the day, you can point at least 15 or 20 other papers that were also written also by similar think tanks and that never realized, right? The US and the US system and these think tanks and so on, they thrive upon like just throwing out a lot and you have so many lobbyists that lobby in so many directions. So which ones get implemented and which ones not? And I don't think that there's a clear trajectory for that.
And you select those that you want to select.
Yes.
And you select those opinions and those arguments that match your own arguments and your own opinions. And when you spend 40 years thinking of Russia as an enemy, some of you will have the wisdom, and I was very honored, very privileged to work with people that I worked with, whom I work with. Those people will have the wisdom of overcoming their bias, but many of them will not. And it's human to not overcome and to select from that flurry of reports and arguments, to select the arguments that suit your interests, what you want to do. For example, make billions and billions of dollars on war, because we have a military industrial complex, which you're aware of, and they're lobbyists. You select what is in your economic interests and what coincides with your pre-existing beliefs. It's cognitive psychology 101. It's very simple.
I invited you to this channel because you were recommended to me by Jeffrey Sachs, whom I agree with. I mean, we are an example of the confirmation bias. We can't even escape it ourselves.
Yes, but we're aware of it. And
yes.
I will never offend someone and call him, I don't know, a Washington puppet or Trump puppet just because he disagrees with me, because we need to be aware that we have our biases, they have theirs. You would probably not be opposed to speaking with someone who can present the arguments from the opposite side, but you're not going to call them names. You're not going to, what they do is, what irritates me is they do this script reading. There was this, by the way, brilliant speech by Professor Sachs at the European Union. There was a debate I saw with a gentleman. There's no real engagement. There's no argument, counter-argument. He was reading a script. This guy is just repeating keywords.
Yeah.
They have this list of keywords and catchphrases that they throw at you. I went to Deutsche Welle here in Armenia for an interview. I walked in and I saw how they're training people to say nasty things about Russia. And I'm like, listen, if you don't like Russia, fine. But you're a journalist. You should not create a bias. From the beginning of your interview, from the beginning of your program, you're creating a bias. This is not professional. It would not listen.
Because
I had to take off the mic and ran off.
Because a lot of people think of arguments as something that you need to win instead of something that you need to learn.
Exactly. But see, it's the same model, Pascal. It's the same model. They're equilibrium people and they're domination people.
Yeah.
In arguments, in personal relationships, in governing countries, there are people who are wise enough to say there's an equilibrium. Let's just keep an equilibrium. And there are people saying, no, let's dominate. There are different types of people. We need to study where this comes from. But you know that, for example, right now, finally, I have to applaud certain people in Trump's administration. They said, yes, finally, yes, this is a multipolar world. Let's learn to create an equilibrium. Thankfully, thank God, 35 years of this terrible suffering all over the world because you want to dominate. This was very unwise because, again, another IR theory 101, hegemonic cycles. This is something you learn first year. Hegemons rise and decline. Rise and decline. The power distribution always changes. You will never be the eternal hegemon. We know this from Germans, from Brits, from the Spanish, from the French, from the Dutch, etc. It comes and goes. Be wise. Think in terms of an equilibrium, but it's not sexy, Pascal. To think about peace, to be a leader of peace is not as sexy as be the winner of, somebody who won a war. It's not very sexy. Domination is sexy. Girls like it, some of them. Being equilibrium oriented may not be as sexy. And these organizations that are created for the purpose of winning wars, they don't like you when you go in there full of self-doubt and humility. They want, yes, sir. Yes, we're going to get this done. We're the good guys. They're the bad guys. Let's kick their ass. And it's just so much more, virile and macho to say that. And then you have this. And then you have 1 million people killed in a country that, after 3 years of horrible suffering and bloodshed, is told that everything you fought for was a lie. This is disgusting. This is absolutely disgusting. If I were Ukraine, I would be enraged by this.
Yeah, me too. But it's the truth. I mean, I tell that my students, look, if ever somebody asks you to take a gun and go and shoot a guy, just say no. Just say no, because whenever you do that and when you go, you will be lied to. You will only pick up a gun and try to shoot a guy if people have lied to you time and time again, and if you have bought into the lies. So, I mean, and it's horrible, because the people who have been lied to were absolutely played, but they were played on a very high level, but they have been played. And actually, for this now coming out as a lie is the way for that herd to actually reconcile with the fact that this is dumb. It was a dumb reason to die for on both sides.
But democracies have another weak spot that the elites have discovered. It's called fabricated consent. It's called the manipulation of the public opinion, manipulation of the media. And when you spend billions of dollars on my favorite BBC and Voice of America, I don't listen to them anymore. I'm bitterly disappointed. I can no longer listen to BBC. And it's so ironic that I would do this when I could lose my job and everything for this. And now I'm not listening just because I don't want to anymore. When you put all the billions of dollars into ownership, you own the media, and they keep sending the messages. It's not even an intelligent argument. It's just like a list of keywords and insults that they throw at you from all directions, not just in England or in Europe or in the US. Here in Armenia, they're sponsoring dozens and dozens of NGOs. And all they do is they keep emitting these messages with the same key phrases, catchphrases. Putin is the devil. Putin is Satan. Just demonizing one particular country, demonizing one particular leader who wanted to be a part of NATO in early 2000s. He wanted to be part of NATO. He was the first person who called President Bush after September 11. But we're not told that. You can fabricate consent, you can manipulate the public opinion. And from what I understand, partly also listening to the interviews you did, it started after the war in Vietnam, because during the war in Vietnam, the public opinion was very effective. It immediately applied pressure on the US leadership to stop the war, and they learned the lesson. And it was a so-called living room war, because Americans were in their living rooms, were seeing on television what was happening in Vietnam. They learned their lesson. They learned how to control the media, how to buy out the media. And the invasion of Iraq, I remember the footage on CNN. I don't even take CNN seriously anymore. It's just very unpleasant. It was like boys playing with their father's rifle. On those tanks. Yay, we're going to invade Iraq. Look how cool it is. You could see it was turned into a show. And now thousands of Americans have died. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis have died. It was all for nothing. Iraq turned into, as Trump says, Harvard for terrorists. It was a total failure. But the media would not report that, because the government and the elite, foreign policy elite, they learned how to buy them out. They bought them out. Now they own them.
But I am pretty sure that just out of the system and out of the logic of it all, it will run itself aground, because at some point a 15-year-old student in the high school will hold up his hand and say, but teacher, isn't it a little bit different? I mean, it runs itself out because it becomes so shallow that a 15-year-old high school boy and girl will actually see through it. And I think we are getting close to that point. We're getting closer, at least.
Yes, these are cyclical processes. Look at communism. We were taught that we're going to have the bright future and everyone is going to share equally. And after a couple of decades, our parents did not believe this. My grandfather and my grandmother believed this. But with time, it just kind of fizzled away. It does happen. These are cyclical processes. I'm still a believer in liberalism. I still believe in the West. I still believe in American leadership to an extent, in a European leadership, in Russian and Chinese leadership. I believe in equilibrium, in reason, in restraint, in humanity, compassion, learning from history. I still believe that these processes, they come and go. People like this come and go. One thing that doesn't come and go is hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians who died. It's a crime. This is high crime, and it's disgusting.
Yes, and we will talk about it, and we will write the history of it, and we will name the people who
Not
did
learn
this.
from it.
We will, well,
and we'll learn nothing from it.
We usually learn the wrong lessons, especially we Europeans.
Yes.
Europeans are incredibly, the capacity for learning the wrong thing is mind-boggling. Anyhow, Arthur, if people want to read more from you, where should they go? Do you publish somewhere?
I'm publishing something here with my research center. It's called Center for International Education and Study Abroad. We have a blog, we have a website. It's a group of my colleagues, and if they like to read from me, I would be delighted. I'm writing right now a handbook on international relations theory in Armenia because there isn't one in Armenian. So I'm trying to just condense everything I know from my Stanford years, from American literature, from Western literature, and just kind of condense it into this little book so my students can learn it. And I think I'll be done in a few months, and I would be very grateful for your comments.
Fantastic. And I will try to put, if you send me some links on where people should go, I will put these into the description, and we will keep the discussion going, and we will hopefully have more also with other colleagues, and maybe next time we get to talk about the Caucasus. But for today, I would very much like to thank you. Arthur Khachikian, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Pascal.